Welcome to Coffee and Divination, a podcast about the arts of obtaining hidden knowledge in changing times. Join me, Joanna Farrar, to chat with experts from around the world on tarot, runes, geomancy, and the many ways divination can help us navigate and plan our paths ahead. So thank you for everyone who is joining us live and for everyone who's listening afterwards. I really appreciate you tuning in. Today, we have an incredibly wonderful guest. I'm privileged and honored to welcome Miss Diana Paxson to Coffee and Divination. Ms. Paxson, if you don't already know, she is a very well-known and respected leader in the pagan community. She is an author of nonfiction as well as fiction. She served as in the Norse pagan organization, The Troth, as reedswoman, steerswoman, and coordinator of the clergy training program. She's the author of numerous fantastic nonfiction books, including Essential Asatru, Odin, Magic, Runes, and Ecstasy, Taking Up the Runes, Transportation, The Way of the Oracle, many others. And she is also the author of 29 novels. The 30th, I think, is in production right now. And many of you know a lot of her books, I'm sure. So thank you, Diana, for being here today.
I'm very happy to be here.
I wanted to start out just kind of with the question of how you got involved in this work, in how your path took you from your childhood into the pagan community. If you could kind of give us a little bit of your background.
Give me a time limit.
Yes, I'm sure you. Well, was it something? Let me also add something to that question. Do you feel that there were things that you were drawn to as a child that influenced your later path, or was it something that just came upon you later?
No. I like a number of other people whose stories I've read about. Like a number of the other early pagans, when we did things as children that indicated we were drawn to this kind of path, and then later discovered, oh, that's what it is. And when I was, my mother had given me the name of the goddess. I still don't understand quite what was going on with her, but apparently she had quite a thing about the goddess Diana as a young woman. So she gave me that name. And when I found out that was a name from mythology, I thought I'd better start reading it to find out what my namesake had been doing. So that got me started reading every mythology book I could find. So by the time I was grown, I had a superficial but fairly broad background. I also used to make up little ceremonies. If I found a dead mouse, I would make a little ceremonial funeral for it. And so that, I think, indicated where my affinities lay. In college, my mother was very spiritual, and she actually ended up as a Christian Science practitioner. And as a child, I went to the Christian Science Sunday School, which is really good training for magical thinking. The problem with it, as I eventually realized, was that it doesn't really deal with the physical world very well, because the whole premise is that's not really there. And if you think hard enough, it won't be. So I kind of gradually migrated. We were Presbyterians for a little while because my mother thought I needed a social life. And then I got to Mills College, where the chaplain at Mills was an amazing man, Dr. George Headley. He was also a professor of sociology. And he was a little man with a voice like brown bread and honey, kind of gravelly but sweet. And he not only gave sermons that explained what all of the symbolism meant, but he also worked with energy. And he had started out Methodist and got an additional ordination as Episcopalian. And so the services had plenty of imagery. But it was when he went up to do the ritual, you could feel that something was happening. And boy, I knew that was what I wanted. So I became an Episcopalian and ended up as president of Canterbury Club. And then I got out of college and realized that the rest of the Episcopalians didn't know how to do that. And about that time, I had gotten into science fiction fandom, and that was where I met my first pagans. They were few on the ground in those days, but out here in the San Francisco area, we didn't have many people who had Wiccan initiations. So anybody who wanted to do paganism kind of had to do it by their bootstraps. And it was a great relief to me some years later when I started meeting other early pagan leaders and realized that they had to figure it out for themselves as well. So I was in the Aquarian Order of the Restoration, which was led by Marion Singer Bradley, which worked with the work of Diana Fortune, who was one of the great English occultists who had come out of the indirectly out of the Order of the Golden Dawn tradition. And she is a wonderful writer, and she explains things very effectively. And her books at that time, there's also was very little to read. So there were her books and a couple of other people, but that was about it. So the Marion required that everybody in the group write a ritual for one of the regular meetings. And I discovered that I could write rituals. Yeah, that was encouraging. At that time, it was particularly encouraging because at that time I thought I was a psychic deaf mute. My mother was a very powerful personality, and I was her only child. And I think I know I was very sensitive as a young child, but by the time I was in my 20s, I had shielding like nobody's business, just to maintain my personality with this very powerful. She was a Libra, not a Libra, August. Anyway, so she taught me a lot as well. But in any case, so I thought I would be the one. Every group needs somebody who will answer the door, make sure the candles don't fall into the curtains, go get something that they forgot to put on the altar. And I thought I would be that person. But one of the people in our community was teaching self-induced hypnosis. So I took the class, and I thought at first, well, I'm not getting anything out of this because every time he starts an induction, I fall asleep. And then one day my niece got a Charlie horse and started freaking out, and I found myself just naturally launching into an induction to calm her down. So I realized that my unconscious was clearly paying attention, and that all I had to do was to get the conscious and the unconscious talking to each other. And by this time, I was starting to write. And I also realized that if you want to actually be a successful writer, you can't wait for inspiration. You have to be able to sit down and make it happen. And so I began to work out ways of formulating things I needed to think about and sort of dropping it down the well. And after a while, often in the shower or while washing dishes, there would be a little pop, And suddenly there's an idea. Yeah, I thought this was just charming. So over the next several years, I gradually sort of hacked away at the shielding until I figured out how to take it down when I wanted it and put it back up. And I think that because I had to figure this out bit by bit, that it actually made it easier for me to teach other people rather than somebody who's had it all their life and has no idea how they do it. So that idea of being able to take steps to learn how to do some trance work became the basis of how I've been teaching ever since. In 1978, one of the young women in this ceremonial magic group said she wanted a coming of age ceremony. She was 19, she'd been on her own for a while, and she just felt the need for something, and she asked me to put it together for her. And I thought, okay, how about working with the triple goddess? This was in 1978, and all of the Wiccans knew about Robert Graves, but there weren't very many actual trained Wiccans around. So I thought this was a new and interesting idea. Let's see how it works. And so I wrote a ceremony, and we had women acting as priestesses of the maiden, the mother, and the crone, and we had a discussion of sort of the spiritual aspects of the age-related goddess in a woman's life. And we did the ceremony. And this was the first time that we had all worked in a women-only group. And the energy was different. And we definitely got a hit of there's something there that we can talk to. So we decided to keep on meeting, and that became Dartmouth Circle, which is still going. It's a crone circle now, but we're still meeting every month. And so that was very exciting. And by this time we were in the 80s, and things were sprouting up all over. All kinds of pagan traditions were getting going about things, and feminism was getting going. And so other groups had started, and they would do workshops, and we would go to their workshops, they would come to our workshops, and we all sort of taught each other. By not very long, actually, 82, several of us found that we were doing priestess work. People who had somehow become the office counselor, or somebody needed a wedding done, or, the need was there. And some of us, apparently, there was this little light bulb that goes up off over your head that says the priestess is in. And so we worked out an ordination ceremony, and we also worked out a training group. At this point, some people wanted to also work with men, so we started a second group and a co-ed group, and then I started a group to study the Western esoteric version of Kabbalah, and so throughout the 80s, we were inventing things right, left, and center, and the larger pagan community was growing fast. We joined Dartmouth Circle, joined the Covenant of the Goddess, and at the beginning of the 90s, I somewhat inadvertently ended up first officer of the Covenant of the Goddess, which was a real education in herding cats. I learned a lot. They're great people. So after working with Kabbalah intensively for over 10 years, I thought I needed some balance. And by this time, Michael Harner's book had come out. So I picked that up. And because I had the background in trance work, I was able to pick it up and do the journey and run with it. And so I started developing my own version of a shamanic practice. Uh, at the in '87, I actually got to go to one of Harner's workshops, see if I was doing it right. And at the first day, uh, he has you go down to find an ally. Well, I had several. I didn't need another one. But I thought I'd go down, hang out with the gang. I get there, and there's this raven. And my first reaction is, half the pagan community is called Raven or has a Raven totem. You are redundant. But no, no, no. Yammer, yammer, yammer like they do. So I said, okay, you can be my guide for this weekend. Okay? Second day, he says, we're going to the upper world to find a teacher in human form. And so I say to the Raven, take me to my leader. This is called being set up. And the figure that I recognized when I got up there was Odin. This was not what I had anticipated. I had, in the early 80s, written a book called Persingamen, which incorporated Norse mythology, and I had done a lot of research, so I knew who I was seeing, and I knew why I would never have intentionally looked for him. So, because as a novelist, I know I can make things up. So I used to worry a lot about whether this was genuine or just my imagination working again. So there he was. And one of the things that working shamanically, one of the things that I had been sensitive about was, how do I do this without misappropriation? And in the research for Brisingamen, I had encountered some very interesting information about Northern Scandinavian magic. So there he was, and basically I was given a choice of, how serious was I about learning this stuff? And I said, yes. And he said he would be my teacher. And I thought, well, I've been doing all this sort of thing for 15 years or so, and I had wanted some really cool spiritual experience, and how glad I was that it hadn't happened earlier, because I needed all the training I had so far to pull my pieces back together and get back out once Harner started drumming to come back. And I thought, all right, I've tried to learn things before, and then I got busy, and then I stopped. I don't want to let this drop. If I start a class on the runes, they should be a good introduction to this whole area. I will have to come up with something every month. I'll have to do it. And I won't let it drop. And fortunately, the San Francisco Bay Area community had lots of very active, excited, talented people. So all I had to do was say, hey guys, who wants to do a rune class? And I got 15 really great people. One of them, Tom Johnson, was getting his doctorate in Scandinavian studies and could actually read and pronounce Old Norse, which was a great advantage. So we started the rune class, and again, there was not all that much material out there, but we worked with what we had. And I had the feeling that I was getting downloads of information from Odin for interpretation and understanding. And by the time we'd finished that first year, I had a dozen or so people who all shared a general background in Scandinavian, Germanic, pagan culture and mythology. So then I said, okay, who wants to help me figure out how they did this oracular practice that just looked really fascinating? And they all went, yay. And so I drew on all of the sources that I had found, and I put together a format, a ritual, and by golly, it worked. We would put somebody in the high seat. We do our prayers and our pews, and people would ask questions and they would get answers. So we also, without having intended it, had become a working magical group and realized that we were now a heathen kindred. We formalized that and called ourselves Grafnar, the Ravens. And so by 90, we had basically a kindred. And for the for that first year or three, I knew vaguely that there were other heathen groups out there. I was a little suspicious about them because some of them I have heard were racist, neo-Nazi, and I didn't want to get involved with anything like that. The second year that I was first officer of the Covenant of the Goddess, at our annual meeting, there was a dealer's area, and there was a booth selling all kinds of Norse stuff. So I drifted over there. They also had brought about 5 gallons of mead. And after a day spent trying to run Grand Council, it was really nice to drift over there and pass the horn. And there were 2 guys there who were members of the Troth. And we talked, I talked, they talked, and I thought, well, these guys are okay. So maybe I should check this out. And at that time, the Troth was being run by Prudence Priest, who lived in San Francisco. So the next annual meeting the following February was in the San Francisco Bay Area. So I went. I wasn't going to take my kindred until I was sure they were all right. And that was pretty good. So the second year, I brought the kindred and we did the Seidh ritual for them. They had never seen anything like this. Nobody else in the heathen community was doing anything like this. A lot of people were doing runes, and some were doing a kind of a ceremonial practice. But it was really fascinating to see the reaction. So that's how I got into the Troth, and they made me an elder and put me on the board. There were politics, and we reorganized everything, and I ended up editing the magazine and running the clergy program, which I've pretty much done off and on ever since. In the meantime, I've been writing novels, and Taking Up the Runes, which was my first nonfiction book, was published in 2005 after we'd had several rounds of the rune class and kept revising and revising. And in fact, a new edition of it is going to be coming out early next year, I think. It'll be the same book, same title, but I've added a new foreword. They're putting it out as a wiser classic because I had set it up so that it could be used with the class. A lot of people have started rune classes and used it as a class text. So it's still out there. It's still selling it. And I guess it is a classic.
Yeah. Within our own covenant, we definitely, of course, work with that book because it is just fantastic. So
Thank you.
Anyone listening doesn't know that book. I mean, you could wait for the new edition, but I'm a fan of getting it whenever you can. So
yeah, well, this is
yes,
a great edition.
I just for people who are listening, in case we have some people who are not as familiar with the terms that you just used, can you just define for us Seidh and Spey and kind of what the similarities and differences, how those two terms relate? And
Right. You can analyze Viking Age magic because most of our sources are from right after the Viking Age. So we're fortunate in having the sagas and the Eddas which were written down within 100 years or so of the conversion to Christianity. And so a lot, we have more really than any other culture except Greek in terms of old material. Even, I mean, the Celtic material was written down by Christians as well. And there actually is, my understanding, I could be wrong, is that there's not as much of it. And you don't have anything like the sagas, which actually refer from time to time to religious practice, or at least what the people who wrote it down thought was the religious practice. You have to understand that. So, where do I start with that?
The Seidh and Spey and the word,
Right.
and yeah.
Okay, so the in the material in really Heimskringla, which was written by Snorri Sturluson. It's the history of the Norse kings, and has a large section on early history or early legendary history. And in that, he says that Odin could do all these magical stuff. Some of the things that Odin could do were classed under Galder, which is sort of the Germanic equivalent of words from Latin that have cantare in incantation or enchantment. So Galder is anything you do with words in the voice. And so that, of course, includes a lot of stuff you do with the runes and spoken charms and spells, songs. So that's one type, and that is a lot of what the magic that is ascribed to Odin is, his specialty. However, some of the things on that list are also, that Odin also does, are called Seidh, which is S-E-I-D-H, the final the sound. And there are a number of theories as to the root meaning of the term, but it seems to involve any kind of magic that involves changing consciousness. And so it includes spirit journeying and shape shifting and weather working and all of that sort of thing. But one of the things that it includes is prophecy. And the best description we have of any Old Norse religious or magical ceremony is in the early part of the saga of Eric the Red, set in Greenland, where they're having a famine and they have in the community a seeress, a Runic, who is supposed to be the last of 9 sisters. And she does this oracular ceremony. And what she's doing is Spae, which the English spelling is S-P-A-E. And that is, it seems to be a subset of Seidh. So all Seidh includes Spae, but Spae does not include all of Seidh. But she does it sitting on a Seidhjallar, a Seidh platform. So I think it's pretty clear. I get distracted by this because there's been an academic argument over this, as does happen. So we are also told in Heimskringla that it was the goddess Freya who taught Seidh to the Aesir. So Odin can do these things, but he learned them from Freya. And I should mention that I'm going to be writing a book about Freya for Wiser. And so the Freya is one of the Vanir, and this may have been the characteristic Vanic magic. But anyway, she is the one who taught it, and she was a Bhutithya. She conducted ceremonies, and she was the last of the gods to continue being active and doing stuff. So, so you have these two kinds of magical practice represented by Odin and Freya. And they cover the other sort of magical stream there would be the folk magic from the ancestors, because uh, the uh, the old beliefs, people worked with their ancestors and their land spirits as much or more than they did with the gods. So one of the things that I've seen over the past 30 years, it has been a increasing awareness that the more overtly ceremonial magical practices are only a part of paganism, and that if we want to really understand the old ways, we need to go back to folk magic. And when we start looking at folk magic, you find that there are practices that are very similar from Europe, the village religions in India, Shinto in Japan, tribal religions in Africa. We're all wired the same. So the challenge is to look at what other cultures are doing and then go back to the culture you're working with and find out how what their version of it was. And I say the culture you are working with, not your culture, because as a heathen, one of the things I have to be super conscious about is that whole issue of ancestry. And a lot of people come to heathenry because they don't want to misappropriate somebody else's culture, and they've got some Germanic ancestors, so let's go with that. That was one of the things that interested me too. On the other hand, there are quite a number of people that I have met who are drawn by affinity. And I've kind of been trying to work up my thoughts on this. The Troth will be holding an international conference on Zoom this time called Frith Forge, where we discuss in particular the problems of inclusive heathenry, which welcomes everybody who is called by the traditions and the gods. And as an example of the affinity, up in Washington State, north of Seattle, there's a Shinto temple. And it is complete in every detail. It's absolutely gorgeous. The priest who runs it is this little guy named Barish-san, a little redheaded guy. As a young man, he got into martial arts. He went to Japan to study. He got deeper and deeper and deeper into it, and they finally said, oh, we're going to have to initiate him. He is a full-bore Shinto priest. He has clearly had a soul transplant. His body language is Japanese. His accent is Japanese. His facial features have somehow become Japanese. And he's running the temple with his Japanese wife. And all of the local Japanese American community and a lot of the Seattle area pagans all go up and visit the temple and do ceremonies. This whole thing is fascinating, first as an example, but also because Shinto, being a land-based religion, has had to deal with the question of how do you uproot and translate this tradition that grew out of the Japanese earth into, say, Hawaii or Washington State. And so this temple has demonstrated that it can be done, which is great support to those of us who are trying to practice a Norse or a Greek or Celtic tradition here in the US. I was once interviewed by an Icelander whose first question was, how can you worship the Norse gods in California? And I said, well, the same way you worship them in Iceland. You brought them from, the first settlers brought them from Norway. The gods, in fact, travel quite well. But then you have to get in touch with your own local land spirits and your own personal ancestors, whoever they may be. And as an example of that, every fall, we do a ceremony honoring the male ancestors and the females in the spring. And at one time we had on one side of the circle a young woman who had lost family members in the Holocaust. And on the other side, a immigrant from Germany whose grandfathers had both died in the Second World War fighting for Germany. But they were both honored ancestors. And everybody hailed them on each side just as loudly. And the ancestors seemed to get along much better in the other world than in many cases they did in this one. So this is all kind of evolved and developed. And again, as a heathen, the whole question of inclusive heathenry and the neo-Nazis, of course, have become much bolder lately. And so we are, the Troth in particular, and other inclusive groups are trying to take a public and vigorous stand against this and to point out that really in the Viking Age, they were class conscious, family conscious, but not race conscious. And there's at least one of the sagas, there's a very prominent family that had got a dark-skinned wife in there somewhere, and they were called Black, but they were heroes and leaders. So it's an interesting and challenging time.
Well, it's a very important discussion, and I'm glad to hear that that's happening. I'm sure that'll be fascinating, and I'm that touched on so many points that I wanted to bring up later. So that's really wonderful.
Yeah, well, I'm used to what people ask.
Yes. In terms of oracular practice, kind of going off of what you had just mentioned about place and the importance of spirits of place and things like that. In your own practice, when you do this work, you can be in a hotel conference room, although not right now, or many other places where you travel. Is there any element to your practice of how you do this that incorporates spirits of place? Because in I think it's in The Way of the Oracle, you talk a lot about setting and the sacred places of the earth that were oftentimes associated with the Sibyls and, the Pythia Delphi and things like that.
Yeah, well, one of the differences between the Mediterranean and Northern traditions was that in the Mediterranean, you had sacred sites, oracular sites, and people would journey to them to consult the oracle. In the North, the oracles in groups would go from region to region and set up as the guests of the biggest farmer in the area, and everybody from miles around would come and they'd all ask their questions. So, which is nice because it gave us as heathen seers a much more useful model for traveling around the country. When I had originally read about this, my thought had been how wonderful it would be if we could put a group together and we could go around to different pagan festivals and do this. And very, very parallel thing. So, as we learned from folk magic and as we learned from Germanic folklore, everything has a spirit. If the Japanese call them the kami, anything with an identity has a spirit. It's animism, essentially. So one of the things that you have to pay attention to is the spirits of the land you're on, but also the spirit in the house you're in or the room you're in. So in a hotel, one of the things I'll do is just put out a glass of water in a corner for the white, the W-I-G-H-T, of the hotel. And we also honor the doors who support the four directions, support Midgard. Partly because when we started, everybody previous training had been Wiccan. And we were used to calling recorders. But establishing yourself in relation to the directions is also a very good grounding and centering kind of practice. And I may have over-engineered the Seidh ceremony a bit, but I tried to touch all the possible bases. And my basic approach to trance work is that you create cues and you condition people to respond to them. And so everybody on our team is used to doing things in a certain way. And we have discovered, though, that if you do it long enough, you internalize the cues, and you can get along quite nicely without having much of any kind of a support system. So when we are at an indoor festival, we'll be in a hotel, one of those hotel conference spaces. We go in and we cleanse it thoroughly, especially at a festival, because there was the year that the people before us had been doing a ritual to Kali. And fortunately, we had not positioned the high seat right on top of where their altar had been, but the altar had been between where the seeress was and where the people were. And there was this kind of peculiar energy going back and forth with the questions and the answers. And so ever since then, we have been particularly careful to A, find out who was ahead of us, and B, just make sure, even if it was good energy, as we were assured by a group ahead of us at one point who had left, they'd been doing a phoenix ritual and they'd left shreds of gray tissue paper all over the floor. But it was good energy. Yes, but it was not our energy.
Yes.
And also the hotel had to come and vacuum the room before we could use it. So we have learned many things about setting up in weird places. And we have a high seat which bolts together and comes apart and goes into the back of the car. So when we're driving to something, we can just take our special thing with us. However, when I travel, I just say, see if you can find a large, interesting-looking chair, and we'll throw a bedspread over it. We have found that with sufficient experience, a seer can just sort of do it. You internalize the cues, and you mainly need somebody to handle the choosing the questionnaires, the interface. And in that, it's more like the way that the Irish seers operated. They could just sort of drop into trance with the snap of the fingers, and of course, then you had to interpret the answer, but that's often true in any oracular practice. So the becoming aware of where you are is the grounding, really, of the practice. Now, we have, in fact, figured out how to do the oracular Seidh on Zoom, which we'll be doing at the end of the month. And so rather than calling on the spirits of the place, I'm sort of asking the Norns to weave us something in CyberGuard. And we take that down at the end. And I think it gives people a sense of focus and security. But we have, as we do it, we have one of our trained people whose husband is trained as a warder. So we put her as the seeress, and I, from a different location, am acting as guide. And then we have people asking their questions from wherever they may be. And it actually has been working.
Mm-hmm. And that also comes along with that technique that's built up and internalized, so that then it can adapt to new situations and new ways, or new places, like you were saying. The Celts could just drop in, so there's just that internalization of it, which only comes through technique and practice and time.
So a really experienced seer needs only somebody to handle the interface. A really experienced guide can take a new seer and support them. So one of the two needs to have experience.
Mm-hmm.
But,
so the work of a seer requires the work of the guide, and all these other aspects of it require, training and time
mm-hmm.
and technique and all of that. It's such an important thing. What do you think are some of the most important skills, or some of the traits that are important for a seer, or for someone who is called to this work? What do you look for in someone that you're training, or do you think is important for this work?
Well, one of the requirements would be wanting to do it in order to serve. That's something I got out of the Western esoteric tradition. I seek to know in order that I may serve. And so that is the attitude that one needs. Even people who think that they are not talented psychically can often be trained to do this. I mean, the first person I ever tried it with was someone, probably the best trance subject that I ever met, and I knew that whatever I did, he would probably go into trance. But as time went on, I was able to do it, and with the right kind of support and setting, even in a workshop, we could get quite a few people to be getting somewhere. When we teach, we do workshops which sort of introduce people to the basics. And then we say, get a copy of my book, Transportation, work your way through that, which will give you a group of people who all share a training in spirit journeying. And then on that, you build the actual oracular practice, where the idea is that the way we do it, we take the whole group in a very light trance state down with a path working down to the gates of the underworld. And then the seer goes through and falls into a deeper level of trance. I do this because I think it improves the process to put everybody in a state of light rapport. And it also gives the rest of the audience something to do. Because just listening to somebody answer a whole string of questions from other people when you're just sort of sitting there, I think can get rather boring. However, there are other groups that have started doing this, and many of them dispense with that. And the seers still get answers. I just think that the production values and whole impact of the whole experience is more profound when everybody has some consciousness changing it as well. But mainly, like getting to Carnegie Hall, practice. And, but I think everybody, almost everybody has the ability to do some level of trance work. The main issue, I think, for a lot of people is worrying about losing control. So this is where my approach involves developing your own cues and conditioning yourself to respond to those cues. So sometimes, in addition to the stuff we usually have in the ritual, we may have people may develop their own songs for their spirit animals, their allies, and we'll add that. Whatever. Sometimes some people will take a particular name that they use when they're doing this work, and that acts as cue. So there's a lot of processes that one can use. But I am strongly of the opinion that it is safer for everybody involved if this is a very disciplined practice. And like possessory work, it is a community practice. And so if you have a team of people watching out for each other, I think you can dare much deeper work than when you have to do it all by yourself.
Which also goes back to what you were talking about in terms of service. Something that was, I think
well,
this is so important.
Especially with oracular work, somebody has to ask the questions.
Mm-hmm. Yes, this is not sightseeing in the other world.
We do that sometimes.
But yeah, just in terms of that renewing of discipline, I mean, do you find that you yourself go back to basics sometimes, to some practices that you tell people that are new to it to do, or kind of do you reach a point with your work where, there are certain things you don't need to do again, or do you constantly kind of cycle through again?
We cycle through. We have a sequence of classes that we do here in my community. Mm-hmm. And we will find that when we do the trance class, often we'll have several experienced people who just want to brush up. And so running the classes periodically, there's the basic trance class, there's the Seidh class, there's folk magic. The Seidh can then move into possessory work for those who are interested. That's the one that we are most hampered with during the isolation. We can do the oracle work, but possessory work really needs to have the community around you. And which it's not to say that sometimes people don't do it, but if the God is in, the God is going to want to talk to somebody.
Yes, and that possessory work, and even, I mean, the trance work as well, involves a very good grounding and a very good knowledge of oneself and the way I know you've written a lot about understanding the way that various cultures have broken down the soul and how we kind of understand ourselves, because if you don't have that self-knowledge first and you try to leap off, it's very dangerous. So could you talk maybe just a little bit about that soul part concept and what's important?
Yeah, well, a lot of cultures have in fact come up with the idea that it's not just the body and the soul. It is that there's the body is a soul. There's the etheric body. There's several levels depending on how you break it down. And we have in psychology the conscious and the unconscious and the id and the rest of it. So the person you think you are, the conscious level persona, which is more or less consciously that, depending on who you are. But if you think about it, we all have experience of this. The person that you are at work in the office is not exactly the same person that you are at home with your kids, or with a community doing sports or a craft. So we all have different communities. This actually, I can digress for just a minute. I've been in the current political situation, I've been trying to figure out this whole identity issue, because a lot of the neo-Nazi types keep talking about the white Anglo-Saxon tradition and what the white identity is. And that's got me looking at the several different British cultures who were the first colonists and all of the other cultures that have come in, and what is American identity. And so the idea of there's you in your family, there's you in your community, there's your identity in your state or region, was your identity as an American and as a Terran. And the religious, spiritual identity is part of this. So, and that's just conscious stuff. And then I think that there is a soul part that is the thing that continues on. Now, one of the people in the Troth, Winifred Hodge Rose, who has done a lot of work with linguistics, and she notes that in the old Germanic languages, where modern English can only translate spirit or soul, there is in fact about a dozen different words, and they could possibly be identifying different soul parts, which gives you the charming idea that at death, just as the body's systems all diverge, all these soul parts could go to different places. So one part of you could end up with your ancestors. Another part could be hanging out with your favorite god. Another part could reincarnate. Another part might be hanging around where you're buried. So, all of the above. And so it's kind of complex, but she, in fact, is currently doing an online workshop on this whole concept. And she's written a number of articles for Arjuna, our magazine. And I hope eventually we'll be able to get a book out of her on this, because it's just fascinating to look at.
Yeah, that would be fascinating. I've heard of that in various other traditions in parts of Africa, about how parts can be reincarnated, and yet there's other soul parts that are with the ancestors or with the spirits of place. Yeah. It's much more multifaceted than our body, soul, maybe mind, if you want to split that up as well. But
diversity.
Yeah. So that also kind of takes me to the practice of doing oracular work, or I guess you could say this about any form of divination, involves bringing back information, being able to go, as you've already said, and bring back something, which means you need to be able to go and come back, and you need that self-knowledge and that trust in your abilities in order to open up and do that in various ways. And then you also need discernment when you get back, in order to know how to interpret or how to help disseminate that information. And you've talked, I know you've written about discernment and how important that is for people.
It's an interesting balance, because you also want to avoid second guessing yourself or interpreting, which doing the ritual within a particular cultural context with people who are trained in, who have a broad grasp of the mythology and cultural background. I can remember some workshops where we had an inexperienced or somebody from another tradition, and they saw something which I recognized from the mythology, but they did not recognize because they didn't have the right background. And I have a story from a friend of mine, the Sheva Kaftal, who is Israeli and comes from a very interesting Israeli tradition of early Hebrew religion. But anyway, she once went to a psychic, and the psychic said, psychic said, "I see a bunch of men in bathrobes throwing balls at you." She starts laughing because she'd been in the Israeli army. So, but it's an excellent example of what the psychic was unable to interpret what she was seeing because she didn't have the right background.
Yeah, it's also trusting what you've gotten.
Yeah. It can be an issue sometimes to try and figure out how to say what you're seeing, especially if you think it might be bad news. And at least one example where the question had been, how soon can I have children? I'm trying to get pregnant. And later on, the seeress told me that she had seen nasty stuff in the uterus area. What she said was, you may have difficulties, you definitely need to see a doctor. So
yeah.
But you don't want to second guess yourself too much, because very often the answer will come through in imagery, which the seeress does not understand, because it's completely unique to the querent. And all you can do is say, this is what you see, and hope it's okay. But this is one reason why we have warders at the ceremony who are prepared not only to keep anybody from outside disturbing us, but they're prepared to be there with a glass of water and some Kleenex, because very often the answer will hit home. And the seer, doesn't, but could say, what I say, because it was unique personal imagery that they picked up. And so if you keep it in the imagery, then sometimes the only person who will understand it is the querent, and at that, sometimes not until later. So you don't want it to shape the answer too much. But we do get a lot of, you should talk to a lawyer about this. You should talk to a doctor about this. Or sometimes the seeress knows a book that might help you, because as seer, you're drawing on the data bank of the person and your knowledge of community resources. So the more information you can get, the better.
And then with that in mind, what is your interpretation of that interplay between fate and free will? How much is changeable versus not? I remember reading one section of one of your books mentioning that some interpretation of Germanic culture might be that there isn't really the concept of future per se, but that it's just an interplay of like past with present actions.
Right. There's a book by Paul Bauschatz, Bauschatz, called The Well and the Tree. Mm-hmm. That's a lot easier to remember. And it's about concepts of time and fate in Germanic cosmology. And the basic argument is that the names of the three Norns, in the three fates, are explicitly doing this about the past, this about the present, this about the future. But the three names of the three Norns are derived from forms of the verb to be, actually two different verbs meaning to be. And unlike, say, French, to have future in Germanic, you need a helping verb. This will happen. I'm going to run. I'm going to walk instead of marcher in French. So the Urd, which is as in the well of Urd, if you are familiar with German, where the you are, this and that means a primal something. So the well of Urd, what's laid down in it is everything that has happened. And the Norns sit by the well of Urd, and they lay down Urle, which is the and the lay is the root of law, as well as to lie down. laying down the law is actually redundant. And they lay down the urlog of people. Now, that urlog is what you start out with. And so there are certain things in our lives that we're stuck with. We're in a certain time, a certain place, parents, community, physical genetics. That's what you're stuck with when you're born. And to a great extent, our environments shape us, and there's nothing much we can do about that. However, the second norn, verdandi, that's the present participle. That's being, doing, going. And that's where we live. We are constantly in this ing part. And every time we perform an act or make a choice, we're laying down something more in the well, and that becomes our urlog. So our fate, to use the Latin word, is a combination of what we were given to start with and all of the choices and actions that we've taken during our lives so far. So each moment we are still shaping that. Now the third, shuld, comes from the other verb, and it's kind of a should shall word. So based on everything that you've said and done, been in the past, and the decisions you're making at the present moment, what should or shall happen is this. And very often in a Seidh answer, somebody wants to know, should I move to New Jersey? Actually, sometimes the answer is no. Sometimes the answer is why. I don't want to trash New Jersey. I have some relatives and friends in New Jersey.
I have family in New Jersey, but I moved from New Jersey.
Buried in New Jersey. My father's family came from New Jersey. But anyway, we did have that question once. But the most likely thing to happen, sometimes the answer is, I see 3 roads. If you go down this one, you get this. If you go down this one, you get the other thing, and so forth. It's because there are going to be more decisions and factors affecting the future. And the best example of this problem comes from the folklore of the legends of Delphi, where the king of Lydia was contemplating attacking Persia, which is usually a bad idea. But he sent to Delphi. Well, first he sent agents to all of the oracular centers and said, tell me what I was doing 100 days after the envoy set out. And Delphi was the only one who got it right, which was you are boiling the meat of a turtle and a lamb in the bronze cauldron. So he figures, all right, Delphi, they've got it. So he sends the next group, which says, what'll happen if I attack Persia? And the answer is, if you cross the Halys River, a great empire will fall. He goes, great. And he crosses the river, he fights the Persians, he loses the battle, he gets captured. And eventually he gets ransomed, he goes home, the first thing he does is send another delegation to Delphi with basically, what the fuck? And it's clear that the oracle doesn't quite know how to answer this question, because it was, well, actually, it could have been much worse. Apollo spoke to the fates, and that you were going to get killed. And look, you're alive. And second, your ancestor did something, so that was a black mark. And uh, but the, I think the answer should have been, so many decisions had to be made by so many different people and so many factors that at the point when the answer was being given, there was just no way. The only accurate answer that could be given was that something's going to happen. And, so having seen those times when clearly the future branches, so I tell people, even though the factors in the situation may make it overwhelmingly likely that one thing or another will happen, very often the future is still fluid. And so the one thing that we do have control over, at least usually, is our own decisions, our own responses to the things that we're faced with.
Yeah.
Sometimes in the Volsunga saga, King Sigmund is very badly wounded, and Odin has broken his sword, and his wife manages to find him on the battlefield, and he goes, "Okay, let me do the first aid." And he says, "No, no. Clearly, the time has come. I'm an old man. Odin clearly doesn't want me to fight any more battles. It's time for me to go to be with the ancestors." So he is seeing the culmination of all of his decisions and everybody else's decisions, and has decided, okay, this is the way it's supposed to be. So,
yeah, and that interplay between decisions of the past and decisions that you then take based on that knowledge.
Yeah,
that's one of my favorite stories about Delphi copies. By the way.
Yeah, well, I think it's a nice balance, and I think it does help one to deal with challenges and traumatic events. That we at least have the choice of how we meet fate.
Mm-hmm. We have a couple of questions that came through. We have many questions that came through in the chat, which I will kind of cycle through in a sense, but just kind of briefly, even though it's a huge question, someone asked, where do you see this information as coming from? Where does the seer, who is the seer asking in this process? When you go down, who reads?
In Delphi, the seer specifically asked Apollo, and Apollo got it from Zeus, who knows everything. But in the saga of Eric the Red, she says that the spirits are telling her. Whether the land spirits or other spirits she works with is not clear. The experience of most of us who've been in the chair, occasionally somebody asks a question and you get this overwhelming yes or no, or just ding, ping. The fellow who said asked how could he stop his cat from getting on his altar. Sirius said, "Is the altar dedicated to anybody in particular?" "Why, yes, Freya." Oh. And not only the seer, but all the other trained people who were in the group went, "It's a feature." So sometimes you get that. So sometimes an image will just appear. I tend to be a very visual thinker, and so I will already have gotten into a state of visualization by making the journey and by moving into hell, or in some cases down by the Well of Weird. And so if something doesn't start coming through immediately, I'll ask my raven who after that workshop decided to stick around. Please, we're not here for our health. Show me something. And she'll fly off, and I'll start seeing things which I can then interpret to get an answer. So that's one way that works for some people. Sometimes images just sort of spontaneously appear. Sometimes you just get a message that comes through. So it varies not only from seer to seer, but depending on what the situation is.
Yeah.
Yeah. There can be an overwhelming yes/no response. You have no idea why you got that.
Yeah, because you are there in order to facilitate that information to come through, regardless of who it's. Yeah.
The skill is to get opened, and why I possibly over-engineer the ceremony, but it's to give lots and lots of support both to the seers and the people who are watching. And because the more confident you are in your support, you know that the guide is in rapport with you, and the guide can like send in a posse to get you out if anything that's too exciting, which it hasn't, I have to say. But you can, the more support you have, the more you can relax and just have faith that something useful will come through. There is often a moment of, oh, it's not going to work, nothing's going to happen. But that's where the trust, and you have to, at that point, have to go, okay, this is not about me. Here's somebody who needs an answer. And the more the person needs the answer, the easier it will be. That this is true. So frivolous questions don't really get answers. They get slapped down, actually. Like the person who said, what kind of ice cream did I have tonight?
Yeah.
But the deeper the need, and the ceremonial aspects put the clearance into a state of mind where they also are able to relax and open up and feel what their need is. So it's a very interactive process.
Would you say that need imperative is there with reading runes? Do you feel that makes a difference as well? My question kind of leads into another question that I wanted to ask, which is, do you always suggest that people read with a question in mind, or you can read just to be understanding and maybe for the day or something, or do you feel like you should only go to these sources if there's a real need involved?
Well, when I read for people, I say, if you have a specific question, we can do the 3 runes and go with that. But a lot of the time people come to me wanting a sort of what's going on in my life anyway. And I found that it's actually possible to do this online or in a Zoom meeting or FaceTime, where if they have a set of runes themselves with them, they can draw. If we're doing it in person, they draw from my bowl. Otherwise, I draw. And I use the layout of the 9 worlds as a format. So there's a little inspiration from tarot there. But the answer, the meaning of each rune then becomes a composite of what does the rune mean? What is the question if there's a specific one? And in what world is it? And where is it in relation to the other runes? And I have a piece of paper with the format on it. And so I write the rune down in the appropriate place on the form. And then I start writing down notes and arrows saying, look what you got here in Vanaheim is connected to the thing here in Jotunheim. And so working with the relationships and what, if anything, the parent has told me about this situation. what's going on in my life with employment or with my family, so forth. But gradually putting all triangulating it, you get a lot of information, and you put it together, and a narrative begins to emerge.
Mm-hmm.
So you don't necessarily, you have to have something to start from, but it doesn't necessarily have to be a specific question.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. We had a couple of questions come through that pivot to something slightly different, but I will kind of read them off because they're all very related. One is, what does it mean to be a priestess of a specific deity, a god's daughter? And then there were two others that are related. What does it mean? Oh, there's actually one other that's related. What actions do you take in order to maintain your relationship with that deity? So kind of about relating.
Okay. Even if you're not interested in actual possessory work, the first part of my book, Possession, because I added divine relationships as part of the subtitle, and I dig into those questions. So first, you can work with the gods without having a committed relationship. Second, and so even people who are very active as clergy are not necessarily in that kind of a relationship. Second, there's a lot of different relationships, and some people consider themselves the son or daughter of a deity. Some consider themselves a spouse of a deity. For some, it's an alliance. Sometimes I kind of vary between working for Odin and being one of his old girlfriends. When you have a close relationship with a deity, it's very much like polyamory, and it can become a permanent and deep relationship, and the rest of your family is going to need to understand that. Even if it's not the whole spousal relationship, especially, but it means it really is adding somebody else to your family to whom you have obligations. But for many, it's more friendship. And one of the most delightful in which saga? Oh, Big saga. There's a guy named Thorolf. Half the people in the sagas have Thor as the part of their first name, which makes it a little hard to keep track of them sometimes. But Thorolf, Mossy Beard. And in the saga, it says he was a great friend of Thor. And you read that and go, yeah, that's a nice, that's the sort of the friendship alliance model. And so when the Norwegian king is putting pressure on him to convert to Christianity and become a feudal lord, as opposed to a lord of the land in his own family right, he has a talk with Thor. Unfortunately, we are not told exactly how he does this, but Thor gives him complete instructions on you should go to Iceland rather than converting or fighting, and take the pillars of the high seat with all the Thor carvings on them, presumably, on your ship, and throw them overboard when you get to Iceland, and where they come ashore, that's where you go and take land. This was at the very earliest land-taking period in Iceland. And so he does that, and where they come ashore, he takes the land, and his family is in charge there for centuries. So this idea of a god friend is one that you find, especially in some of the heathen groups. I'm not sure if that model is as popular in other. But heathenry is not the only tradition that has this. You get this with varying degrees of intensity in a lot of the other, especially the Reconstructionist traditions.
Yes, and I want to pivot just a little bit to the runes. We talked briefly about them. This has been so fascinating, but I do want to have a couple of questions. One person asked in the Q&A, and I think it's a great question to go to, which is, how would you suggest the best way to learn to divine by runes is, in your opinion? What is the best way for someone to approach learning the runes? Obviously, we've already spoken about your book. There are classes out there to learn those basics. What are your thoughts?
Yeah. Well, learn as much as you can about them, which means reading the Eddas, reading the sagas, reading stuff about the culture. I should mention my friend Elisheva, who I mentioned before, is in fact writing a book on casting the lots, which will be out sometime next year. And as she's pointed out, it's not enough to know Hebrew. You have to study the Hebrew culture to understand what a camel means. And so, which she and I have had many, many fascinating discussions on reading lots versus reading runes, comparing techniques. Anyway, learn as much as you can about the background. And, so that when you see a reference to ice, you have a picture of all the things that ice could mean in the old days. But you also want to practice interpreting. And so, for instance, if every day you draw a rune or you draw 3 runes, and during that day, look for examples of that rune, relationships to things that are happening in your own life. Since the lockdown began, or isolation, or just not go out so much, I have been drawing some runes each day for a reading of not so much what's going to happen today as what do we need to be thinking about today, originally just in terms of the pandemic, but then in political terms as well. We are in a mess. What should we be thinking about? And, first I drew 1 rune, but then we sort of went through the available runes pretty fast. So then now I will usually draw 3. And the first rune gives you a general context. I have not drawn for today yet. Let me do that and see what we get.
Wonderful.
Okay. What should we be paying attention to today? Okay. What we have got here is Hagelash.
Oh, I was going to ask a question about Hagelash, so.
Yeah, the only good thing about that is it tells me that the runes are paying attention and they have a sense of humor.
Yes.
Sometimes I'll get a rune that appears to have nothing to do with it, and I kind of wonder. Okay, so yeah, we know, everybody, that we are in a traumatic mess, which is sort of my definition of Hagelash. When the hailstone strikes, especially when it's a great big hailstone, it does damage. You're in for a traumatic time. Doesn't mean you won't get over it. But, okay. Okay, so what about this mess that we already know we are in should we be paying attention to? Elhaj, protection.
I see. Mm-hmm.
Okay, yeah, you're hot today. Okay, any particular aspect of protection? Because so far we're just going with things we already know. Nope. Okay, it's redundancy time. Now, Dish.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, this I think is an example of what happens in readings sometimes when you already know the answer, or they don't ask a question unless you're willing to hear the answer.
Wow.
That is funny. Okay, that is the answer for this event. I'm going to draw another set about, because that one was clearly.
It's dramatically clear, though. You cannot say it's not dramatically clear.
Yeah. If I was going to draw like 3 runes specifically for what is going on in a pandemic
in the world, yeah,
that's being mismanaged.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So Hagawaj, you're in a mess. What do you do about that protection? What about the protection? You really need it.
Yeah.
Yeah, and now Dish has been turning up usually as a way to emphasize whatever the other 2 runes say.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah,
and oh, well, that's very interesting, because that was something I was going to ask and have you talk about. So there we go. The runes have already spoken. So
well, I've been posting the runes on my on the Rafnar list, the Troth list, Troth members list, and larger community list, and my Facebook.
Mm-hmm.
I'm just about out of room for friends on Facebook, but I think people could sign up as followers, and they would probably then be able to see them.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think if you can go back to my feed, I have them all.
Yeah, and I've been reading those. It's fantastic and really helpful. So that's wonderful.
It really is interesting. One of the things that I found surprising is that periodically the rune for joy will turn up. And, the first response is, what is there to feel happy about? But as some of the people who commented on the readings say, joy helps your immune system.
Yes.
And if you like something like the Diary of Anne Frank, she was in a pretty dreadful situation, and she manages to find just little nuggets of something to appreciate, something, hope or enjoyment or something. I think that being able to find those moments of joy may be one of the best survival tips.
Yes, absolutely. I want to have time for just a couple more questions. There were a few that came through in the Q&A that I want to include. Speaking of runes, and actually in connection with anxiety and pandemic, someone asked a question about bind runes. Also, specifically during this time of needing help and support with anxiety and turmoil, how would you recommend finding or using bind runes? Can you speak a little bit about their use?
Yeah. Well, one of my community who's a nurse asked for a protection bind rune, and piece of paper, envelope. Okay. Okay, so for her, I started with Elhaj, and then to Elhaj, I added Okay, so if you can see, they've got little lightning flashes on the ends. That is a Sowilo rune, and it means the sun. And you can kind of work with that either as the UV in the sun shriveling the viruses, or as Thor, who actually was invoked in the old days for plague protection. And they used to personify the causes of illness as thyrses, as beings of some sort. And so I like to visualize. Actually, let's see if you can see this. This is the most recent issue of our magazine, Aduna. And what we have here in the front is, I took an old painting of Thor fighting the giants, the Jotnar, and just threw in a bunch of thyrses of COVID. Viruses. So now we have Thor fighting the thyrses. Usually he fights giants who are very big, but he can also fight thyrses that are very small. And visualization is a very powerful healing tool. So that could be Thor going in there with his hammer going whack, 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 whack every time he sees a virus. So if you take the runes that you want, I've been doing a lot of runic healing work, which is one of the things that you can do in unison on Zoom, unlike singing, which just sounds horrible. And if you take, instead of visually linking the runes, if you, first I sing one or more runes, and then usually I take a syllable or the Anglo-Saxon form, which tend to be shorter, syllabic, and meld them together in a kind of galdering, a kind of a verbal, oral bind rune. And repeating that a couple of times. But if you've got the person with you, you can actually make the visual bind rune over them in their aura or on the cast, for instance. So yeah, that's a whole, may turn into a book at some point.
I'm sure that would be fascinating and very helpful for a lot of people. So speaking
anyway, let me just finish. If somebody has COVID, the runes I would be working with would be first Ansuj, which is Odin communication, mouth, and therefore anything having to do with air and breath. Odin gave the breath of life in the creation of humankind. So sometimes I visualize Odin marching through the ICU and with the Ansuj rune just giving breath. So Ansuj, obviously, Elhaj, protection, and Yera for healing.
And those three, that you don't necessarily have to create a bind rune with that. It can be
no, you can galder them together.
In succession, speaking of books, we had one question which is related to your fiction works, which I know a lot of people are very familiar with. And let me ask the question as she put it. She's wondering how, when it comes to your Avalon fiction, especially the prequel Ancestors of Avalon set in Atlantis, I would love to know how she comes up with her characters that aren't drawn from Arthurian legend. Do you feel that there's any channeling or an aspect of divination? Are there similarities in how those processes come through for you?
Well, specifically, the characters and ancestors who come from the Mediterranean to end up in Avalon were actually originally characters that Marion had created for a book called, it was published as The Fall of Avalon eventually. That would be the easiest way to find it. Although, not Avalon, The Fall of Atlantis. Atlantis does not, in fact, actually fall in that book, but it sets up the situation. And there's a prophecy in that book that that two of the characters will found a new temple in a new land. So I decided to write the story of how they do that. So I got to write about the actual fall of Atlantis with a lot of inspiration from Pliny's description of the eruption near Naples. And but the characters that they find there, in writing any novel, you have to come up with characters. It doesn't. Any novelist has a process. So I usually start with what can I find out about the place that they are going to? What was Britain like at 2000 BC? And what can I find out about the cultures and the archaeology? So there's a lot of research there. And where can the characters come from? There are certain roles that you know are going to have to be fulfilled.
Are there any times that it feels like that information is coming sort of from elsewhere, I guess is kind of, I'm imagining.
Not necessarily specifically for the characters, but yes, information does come from elsewhere. The first time I noticed this when I was writing The White Raven, which is about Tristan and Isolde. And it actually functions as a kind of sequel to Mists of Avalon. But I felt that Isolde had to be buried with Tristan. And I knew from my research that there was this pillar called the Tristan Stone, which said, "Here lies Tristan, son of Conamoras." Conamoras is the other name for King Mark. So King Mark was historical, and he had lands both in Brittany and in Cornwall. And Tristan is the early form of Tristan. So we know that Tristan was buried in Cornwall, and he was the son of King Mark. Nothing, I found out later that in the 16th century, an Elizabethan scholar had been able to read at the bottom of the pillar, which is now worn completely away, a reference to Isolde.
Wow. So
they were buried together. Now, in Ancestors, all that Marion had said was a new temple in a new land. Okay, what kind of a temple? That she had in the Mists of Avalon, where Egirna has a vision of herself and Uther standing on the plain, Salisbury Plain, looking at Stonehenge. And so I already had the whole reincarnational system going, which I established earlier, which Marion had also hinted at. So, okay, it has to be Stonehenge. Well, what kind of a temple was Stonehenge supposed to be? And then I thought of the legend of Merlin having sung up the stones by magic. So, okay, maybe it's sound. And I also, having been looking at pictures a lot, I went to the symphony, San Francisco Symphony, and I happened to look up at these baffles that they have all over, suspended from the ceiling. And I went, wait a minute, the shape of those baffles reminds me of the shaping of the stones at Stonehenge. I wonder if it was sound. All right. So then I, cooked up a whole thing about they're going to use the sound vibrations to send energy along the ley lines and control the country. So after I had finished the book, I found in Popular Archaeology an article about archaeologists going and doing sound experiments in various Neolithic monuments. And in fact, when they did things with sound inside Stonehenge, you couldn't hear it from outside, even in its current state. And another friend who is in the magical community in Britain said, furthermore, when you're in the circle doing something, you can't hear what's going outside. So it was sound.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Now, probably not intended to channel energy down the ley lines, but who knows?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's elements of sound in all sorts of different, now they're finding all sorts of different sites and temples. So yeah, that's fascinating. I want to finish out with kind of a general question, which I want to open up to you to answer how you want to. Mm-hmm. Is there any form of advice that you would like to give people, either, surrounding working with runes or anything else, just in terms of practices that you think would be very helpful for people? Especially we're in this very stressful time. Is there advice that you'd want to pass on to people right now?
Well, practice, definitely. I mean, to develop any kind of skill, try drawing a rune each day and looking for its significance, as I said. And then you have to have a kind of a balance. On the one hand, you have to be willing to trust that you're getting useful information. On the other hand, you don't want to be too dependent on it. So there's always the I could be wrong. So there's a kind of a cautious confidence, I think. I think with time, the more you do reading for yourself, reading for others, you develop a better sense of when you're on. Okay, when the first rune you draw is obviously relevant to the situation that's just happened, then the runes are going to talk today. Don't ask them a question when you already know the answer, however. They tend to. And if you keep drawing in hopes that you will get an answer you like better, then you start they get snappy. So it's, the first thing, the sign on to the left of the door into the Temple of Apollo at Delphi was know thyself. The sign on the right was nothing too much. Mm-hmm. So you have to keep it in balance, because no matter what you think you read, you still are going to have to make the decisions on what to do about it.
Very, very, very true. Yes, that's wonderful. Thank you so much. I want to ask you if you could, you've already mentioned a few of the ways that people can sort of connect with you. Can you let us know all the ways to be in touch with you, or, your digital things?
Yeah, there's check my website, which there's a contact link. Mm-hmm. It's Diana Paxson, www.diana-paxson.com, and that will give you a contact link. Mm-hmm. You could check out my Kindred's website, which is www.hrafnar.org, and there's also a contact address there. Mm-hmm. You can check out my Facebook. I try to,
especially if you want to see the runes that you are pulling.
Yeah,
I would highly recommend for people.
Yeah, it's been fascinating, especially when you'll have like one rune sort of working its way around through a couple of days, and then it'll go something cheerful for a couple of days, and then it'll be something not so cheerful for a couple of days.
Balance in all things.
Yeah.
Oh, but it's still sometimes it's Hagelaz to start. So.
Yeah. Okay.
And then you have books coming out, like that you mentioned, the new edition of Taking Up the Runes, and another novel that's coming out. What is the name of the next novel that will be coming out?
Well,
Just,
the next novel that I have to get out, because my editor died, I'll be bringing it out myself, which means I have to get everything together to do that.
Yeah.
It's titled The Turquoise Scepter, and it is the sequel to The Golden Hills of Westria.
Fantastic. I'm going to have all the links to all of your stuff in the show notes for people. So if you're just listening to this.
The Essential Asatru is coming out next spring, and a new, slightly updated version of that is coming out next spring from Citadel Press. The Taking Up the Runes is the new edition is coming out from Wiser Books. I am working on a book about Freya for Wiser, and also a book called Carrying a Torch for Liberty, which is about working with American symbols to recover and re-energize their meaning, their original meaning, which it kind of ticked me off when I went to a rally and it was the alt-right that was wearing the American flag.
Yeah.
One of my suggestions for affirmation is every time you see a flag, just say liberty and justice for all, and visualize some example of that. If thousands of people did that all the time, there could be a real psychic shift.
Yes. Yeah, and it's so important for us to have faith in those symbols and use them appropriately, all of us together.
Yeah. I mean, this is not to say that people were perfect who came up with them.
Oh, definitely not.
If we have to be perfect, we might as well give up right now. I think with all this discussion of founding fathers and their flaws, I think the fact that they were able to accomplish what they accomplished despite their flaws gives us hope. Let's see what we can accomplish.
Yeah. Yes, certainly. Certainly we all need that room in order to grow. Otherwise, we're all lost.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Diana. This has been just an amazing conversation that I appreciate so much, and I'm sure our listeners will appreciate so much. And I hope we will get to talk again in the future about another book.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. And thank you, everyone, for joining us live. As expected, that was a fantastic discussion with Miss Paxson, and we could easily have continued chatting for quite a bit longer. I'm looking forward to talking with her again on other subjects and seeing her new editions and works as they come out. As always, thank you for listening. Thanks to everyone who joined in live and submitted questions via the webinar. We do that each time via Zoom, so check our website to register for free. Please subscribe to the podcast, leave us a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts if you enjoy what we're doing here, and share it with your friends. And check out our website at coffeeanddivination.com. You can also find me on Twitter, where I am @FiddleAngel. Enjoy your journeys with divination, and we'll see you next time.